Good morning and welcome everyone to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research's Summer Economic Forum. And looking out of my window, it is actually a beautiful summer's day today. So hopefully the same is true wherever you're joining us from. My name is Stephen Millard. I'm the Deputy Director at NIESR for Macroeconomic Modeling and Forecasting, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. We have three speakers. We have Barry Naisbitt, who is going to kick off by talking about the outlook for the global economy. We've got Ben Caswell, who's going to talk about the outlook for the UK economy, but also, given that we have a new government in place as of last month, we thought it'd be a good idea to talk about the major problems, if you like, the key parts of the economic inheritance that the new government will need to be grappling with as we move forward. So Ben's going to talk about that as well. And then we're going to have Arnab, who's going to talk about regional regeneration. Although it says outlook for UK regions and households, it's all about the regions, all about regional regeneration. If you'd like to ask questions, please could you put your questions into the chat? Then when we get to the end of the presentations, I'll call upon you to ask your questions of each of our presenters. I think that's about it for now. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Barry, who's going to talk about the outlook for the global economy.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our Summer Economic Forum. And I'm going to present our global economic outlook, which we've just gone to press with. It's very much a team effort, as you can see from the names on the introductory slide. And I think at this point it's worth saying that we use our global macroeconomic model, NIESR, to prepare our forecast. And if you don't already subscribe to NIESR, then we'd be very interested to talk with you about how subscribing could be beneficial in your work. So do please get in touch with us if you'd like to take up that option. My presentation really is, I suppose, in two parts. The first part is something about where we are now in the global economy. The second part is really the forecast, our forecast for where we think we're going. Some key takeaways or headlines from our forecast. We have resilient economic activity thanks to largely the services sector rather than manufacturing globally. And we're forecasting global GDP growth of around 3% both this year and next year, which is rather similar to last year. Inflation, the other sort of major economic item, is down, but not out, as they may say. So we're still not there in terms of reaching inflation targets more generally, particularly in the advanced economies. And what we're starting to see, and we believe will continue, is a gradual shift in the monetary and fiscal policy mix, with monetary policy gradually loosening in particular as we go forward. On fiscal policy, we think there's really limited fiscal capacity, particularly in the G7 economies, for responding to future shocks. And that's, again, part of that change. In terms of sort of big events, well, many of the events we've talked about in the past year, I guess, are still with us as risk items in the global economy. And moving closer to the horizon for us is clearly the US elections and the trade policies of the candidates there. So there's things that we're monitoring as we speak. What I'd like to do is just run through a couple of slides on where we are and then move on to where we think we're going. So in terms of annual GDP growth, amongst the major advanced economies, the US stands out. on the positive side. Annual GDP growth is running between 2.5% and 3% over the last 3 or 4 quarters. Very strong, and we're expecting that to weaken as we go forward. The other side of the coin, if you like, is the euro area economy, which is the sort of maroon bars on the chart, which has been very weak. We're looking at that to pick up slightly as we go forward. In terms of emerging market economies, relative to the G7, China and India are clearly seeing growth rates much in advance of the G7 economies, but we're expecting those to trade down a little bit as we move forward. Inflation, if we could go back a slide, please. Thank you. Inflation, headline inflation, you can see has come down very sharply in the advanced economies, just as it rose very sharply. However, we haven't yet come back in headline inflation terms to the sort of target rates. We're stabilizing, or appear to be stabilizing, just a fraction above them. And part of that is, if you like, explained by the recent trends in underlying inflation. Underlying inflation didn't rise as much as headline inflation, but it's also fallen more slowly and still looks, if you like, above target rates, and is, I guess, a concern in many of the G7 countries. In terms of interest rates, what we're seeing, if we could move up, the monetary policy rates have peaked, we believe, and are now starting to come down everywhere. The obvious exception on this chart here is now the US, but we're expecting US rates to fall soon. And we've seen, really, since 2019, all the G7 economies have seen a substantial increase in their debt to GDP ratios, less so in Germany and Italy than in Japan, France, and the US. And interest rates we expect to fall, but fiscal policies appear to be constrained both by the high increased debt ratios, but also the relatively high borrowing ratios in some countries, and the pressure that higher market interest rates are causing on the borrowing requirements. In terms of the outlook, we're forecasting GDP growth to fall slightly from 3.2 last year to 3.1% this year, then back up to 3.2%. I fear I'm making too much of these decimal point differences. It would be probably more convenient to say around 3% in each of those years. Leading the charge are the emerging economies rather than the advanced economies, as has been the case for a long time now. In terms of medium-term outlook, we think there are some headwinds to GDP growth globally in terms of demographics, slower global trade, and challenges from climate and digitalization. And we think that in the medium term, growth of around 2.75% rather than 3% might well be where we end up as a norm. In terms of inflation, here I'm showing OECD inflation, but that's actually OECD inflation excluding Turkey, where inflation is currently around 60%, which would increase the figure substantially, but also sort of mask the true picture for most OECD countries, which is one of inflation falling. We have it falling to 3.5% this year and 2.2% next. The upside risks come from geopolitics and services inflation, as I mentioned before, about underlying inflation. The downside risks may come from a faster decline in wage growth and in services inflation than we're factoring into our forecasts. Global trade growth is slowing. We're expecting this decade to show somewhere around just north of 3% a year GDP, global trade growth, compared to 5.4 in the 2000s and 4.8 in the 2010s, in part due to rising protectionism and what's now known as growing global fragmentation, although that's yet to be really tested, I guess. But the right-hand side chart taken from our Global Economic Outlook shows that the number of trade policy interventions has risen as we've moved over the past 15 years or so. But in particular, it's been the harmful trade policy interventions that have risen rather than the liberalising interventions. It's not to say that can't reverse, particularly for services, but we do seem to be entering or have entered an era where protectionism is stronger than it has been for probably 20 years, particularly coming from the US, I guess. I mentioned our view that fiscal capacity is limited. In terms of budget deficit to GDP ratios, these have fallen from the very high levels we saw, extraordinarily high levels, it's worth saying, that we saw in the pandemic as special measures were taken. But of course, debts have risen as a result, and that's producing a general move to rethinking what fiscal policy should be doing. And it tends to be towards a tighter fiscal policy rather than a looser view on fiscal policy. We have a short article, we call them boxes, in our Global Economic Outlook, written by Lucia Casaro of Prometea, looking at the new fiscal framework in the EU, and the figure on the right-hand side is taken from that, taking 60% as debt to GDP ratio and 3% as the lending to GDP ratio for borrowing. You can see that there's a handful of countries in what's the sort of the good southeast quadrant of that chart, but very many of the EU countries are outside that and will be looking to adjust towards that area over time, gradually, we would believe. Just before I finish, I think should mention something about risks. These are very similar to the ones I talked about last time in May, when we talked about escalating tensions in the Middle East, ongoing war in Ukraine. Those are still with us. Political uncertainties due to US elections, they seem to have changed somewhat with the candidate names changing, or at least one candidate name changing, and that's still developing. In the medium term, rising protectionism and trade fragmentation, and slowdown in China. China's very much been an engine for growth, and whether that's the expectation, our expectation, and others, that growth rate will slow down, will lead to slower global GDP growth. And finally, limited fiscal capacity to deal with new shocks. And finally, let me just leave you with the sort of headlines from our forecast. Global GDP growth around 3%, inflation falling, world trade growth picking up, but picking up for an incredibly slow pace last year, estimated at 1.1%. And in terms of the individual economies, US growth slowing from 2%, 2.5% plus this year and last, and Euro area growth picking up a little bit from sub 1% to around 1.5% next year. Thank you ever so much for attending today's event, and let me hand you over now to my colleague Ben Caswell, who's going to talk you through our UK economic outlook. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation, Barry. So we'll move on to the UK outlook, which is very much a joint effort with all of the people listed on the screen here. So in light of the election and the new government taking office, we decided that this outlook will serve as a special edition. So this outlook includes an extra chapter, and this chapter covers the economic inheritance facing the new government. So we thought that this would provide much needed context and serve as a nice bookend to the tenure of the previous government. After this, we will turn to the macroeconomic outlook, which includes our usual forecasts. And then Arnab will talk about regional regeneration. and everything to do with the devolved regions. Okay, so what have the new government inherited, economically speaking? Well, let's be frank, there are quite a few economic challenges. So many of you, I'm sure, are aware of these, but the first one is low productivity growth. So the UK has performed quite poorly by international and historical standards since the 2008 financial crisis. Secondly, there's low business and public investment. This has been a long-standing issue for the UK economy. So the UK economy has consistently performed poorly with respect to its share of business investment in GDP. This issue dates back to before 2008, but the UK is really towards the bottom of the pack when it comes to business investment as a share of GDP among OECD economies. Moreover, public investment is also badly needed. If the UK is to achieve its goals set out in the Levelling Up white paper as part of a strategy of regional regeneration, better connectivity with good transport links, affordable housing, as well as spending on social care and healthcare is badly needed. And higher public investment is one way to achieve those goals, but public investment has been thwarted, and it's been thwarted by a fiscal framework which have created the incentive to cut investment expenditure. So while the new government has changed its deficit rule, the binding fiscal rule, which is the debt rule, remains unchanged. Therefore, the binding constraint on borrowing to invest is still in place. So this remains a serious challenge. Now, a corollary of all of these issues is that over the last parliament, there has been a decline in living standards as well. And this has been measured in terms of equivalized household real disposable income. And Anna will talk a bit about this in detail, but since 2019, this has fallen, and it's particularly acutely among the lower end of the distribution. Moreover, there is also regional inequality as well. So productivity growth is not uniformly distributed across the regions, the ITL1 regions of the UK. Most of the productivity growth, that's to say output per hour worked, is coming from London and the Southeast. So we can illustrate some of these points that I've outlined as part of the economic inheritance here. So this chart illustrates the productivity point, and it shows output per hour worked for the UK economy, which is in red. And then we have the black line, which is the OECD average. So that's a weighted average for the 20 major OECD economies. And you can see that this line tracks the OECD average very well up until about 2008. And then after 2008, there's a divergence. And you can see that the UK falls behind in terms of productivity growth. And by 2022, it's in the bottom 2/3 of the pack among OECD economies for productivity growth. This has natural knock-on consequences for income, investment, and living standards as well. So this leads us on to the next key issue for the economic inheritance, which is investment, both public and private. So here we can see that the UK performs, again, against the OECD average quite poorly, particularly with regards to business investment. It can be seen that investment as a share of GDP remains quite low, consistently some 2 to 4% below the OECD average. Now, part of this story may be uncertainty, or it may be Brexit or COVID, but these issues are long-standing. And providing a stable policy environment to increase business investment is something that we would like to see going forward. Public investment, you can see here at the bottom. So the red line is the UK share of GDP in public investment, and the grey line is the OECD average. And you can see that while we are close to the average today, historically, we have been below average. So to get public investment and get public services back up to scratch to where they need to be, we do think that there should be a consistent and sustained increase in public investment to 4 to 5% of GDP. With public investment, it's something that the UK has struggled with, historically speaking, and we think that one of the reasons for this has been the fiscal rules as well. So the fiscal rules have exacerbated this issue, and more money is needed to improve health, social care, infrastructure, but they're still being constrained by this debt rule. And the debt rule is that after 5 years, the debt to GDP ratio must be falling. But a lot of these projects are long-term investments, and the payoff is not realized within a short 5-year horizon. So all of these challenges are also coupled with our next point on the fiscal concerns. So there are serious challenges given the limited fiscal headroom. So there is a 60-year tax, debt to GDP is at a 60-year high, and the tax burden is at a high as a share of GDP since the end of the Second World War, 1949, just after the Second World War. Now, you can see here that there is not much room for maneuver. And if we go to the next slide for our projections on the deficit. So here we have our projections for the deficit to GDP ratio. And these are part of our forecast. Now you can see there's a large rise from fiscal year 23-24 to 24-25. Part of this is due to higher interest payments coming in slightly higher than anticipated in the first part of this year, but it's also due to a large fiscal hole, which was highlighted before the election as well, highlighted by some of the work that we've done. So even prior to the public pay settlements, there was a huge gap in what the manifestos were proposing and what was available. Now, this red line is our central forecast, and that's based on the OBR spending plans from the first quarter of this year. And the grey line is the adjustment that we've made based on the Labour proposals in their manifesto. So you can see that there's a slightly higher deficit to GDP ratio once we take into account the Labour spending plans outlined in their manifesto. This is only marginally higher, but we're still knocking around 5% deficit to GDP. Now, the black line here is with regards to the new fiscal rule of the Chancellor, specifically the revised fiscal deficit target. So the new deficit target is to separate out public investment from the deficit. So instead, current day-to-day spending moves into balance. That is to say that current government spending, not public investment, is balanced year on year. But as we can see here, even after we subtract our forecast for public investment, we can see that around 3% is going to be the deficit to GDP ratio. That's less public investment. So even that new deficit rule is still not projected to be met over the next parliament. So to continue on our path of economic inheritance, we can turn to living standards, and we can look across the deciles here as well, as measured by household equivalized real disposable income. And it can be seen since 2019, there's been a fall in living standards across the board, but this is concentrated among the bottom end of the distribution, particularly in the poorest decile. One reason that the poorest decile has been hit hardest here is because they spend a larger proportion of their income on food and energy. And it's the increase in these goods which have been impacted most by the economic shocks over the last few years. So this is why it's been concentrated towards that end of the distribution. Moreover, the energy price guarantee has benefited some more well-off people who consume more energy and have larger homes as well. So turning to our regular economic outlook as a bookend for our economic inheritance and challenges that the next government are going to face over the next parliament, we can look at our GDP forecasts. So as we know, GDP did come in better than expected for the first quarter of this year, 0.7%. It was then followed also by strong growth in April and May, the monthly frequency. Subsequently, our growth forecast for 2024 is revised up from our last outlook to 1.1, and we expect in 2025 around 1.3% growth. Now, this is slightly above trend, but it does reflect a normalization of economic conditions and a general unwinding of tight monetary policy, as well as inflation just coming a bit back down to target. Also, there may be an element which is driven by sentiment. So there's been a lot of policy churn over the last parliament and a lot of uncertainty. And we think that there has been an uptick in expectations in terms of essentially a more stable policy environment going forward, which is conducive to investment and growth. So turning to our CPI inflation forecast, the headline rate of inflation has now hit the Bank of England's target. It hit it in May. It was 2% in May, and it remained at 2% in June as well. So that's good news, obviously. And these recent achievements in hitting the Bank of England's target rate, it's because essentially primarily driven by the cost of energy and food from 2023 dropping out of the index. But now that these indexes have essentially normalized, a lot of these base effects have dropped out. We're now just left with the sort of sticky core component of inflation. So for inflation to be maintained at this 2% target, core inflation and service inflation really needs to come down. That's the only way that it can be sustained at 2%. In light of that, we think that inflation, as a result of strong wage growth, as a result of core inflation still being elevated, we think that inflation is going to rise gently towards the end of this year, and it will reach around 3% in the middle of next year, 2025, before coming back down to target at 2% over the forecast horizon. So there are some upside risks stemming from persistent core inflation, as I mentioned, as well as elevated wage growth and geopolitical challenges. Also, rises in shipping costs too. Now, any combination of these factors could materialize and pass through onto higher domestic prices. In addition, we're also seeing the cost of the national living wage still passing through to service prices as well. This may be moderated by a slightly cooler labor market, but we know that in service inflation is still running hot and wage growth is still very strong as well. But in general, we do consider that these risks to headline are broadly, roughly balanced. Now, as our last point, we will turn to the monetary policy rate path. As we can see here, we've got our anticipation for how there's going to be an unwinding of monetary policy. We can see here that our expectations are that essentially the path down to R star is slightly slower than market expectations. One reason for this is that we expect relatively strong performance this year and next year in terms of output growth, and this does put a little bit upward pressure on inflation. Moreover, we also have a settling around a slightly different point as well. So the market comes in at around 3.75%, but we come in slightly lower at 3.25%. And the reason for this is that essentially 3.25% is pretty much where we land if we take the inflation target of 2% and our trend rate of growth. We approximately land there. So we think that 3.75 is maybe slightly high. That's because our trend rate of growth is just slightly above 1% in the UK economy. So in other words, a lower trend rate of growth essentially reduces the economic speed limit, and then that limits the bank rate, and we think they will come down to 3.25. And that's pretty much where we stand on our unwinding of tight monetary policy. It's a little bit slower than the market expects, and we come in, again, a little bit lower at the end of that point. So that pretty much sums up our UK outlook. And I will leave you with our final slide, which summarizes some of our key variables before handing over to Arnab, who will talk about regional regeneration and the regions.
Thank you, Ben, and Barry and Stephen before that, and welcome everyone. We have done our regional analysis slightly differently this time. Keen observers of NIESR's work would have noticed that over the past 4 years, we have been developing quite a few additional models in addition to NIGEM, which Barry talked about earlier. In particular, NIREMS, our regional model, and Linda, our distributional model, but also our sectoral model, NISEM. So this models, suite of models are in a good shape now, and increasingly, if any of you are more interested in knowing about these models, maybe playing around with it a little bit, then please do get in touch with us. But in any case, so Ben has set the scene very well with respect to distributional consequences of the shocks which have hit the economy, particularly the pandemic shock, Brexit, and the cost of living crisis. What we are now going to do is talk about regional disparities. As ever, it is joint work with a lot of fantastic colleagues. So regional disparities and policy priorities for the new government is what we are going to focus on. So the key messages are that entrenched disparities of wealth, health, empowerment, they continue. So they are entrenched across the country. They have been entrenched for a long time. And the scale of this task is progressively greater now since 2019 and even further back since the time of the global financial crisis in 2009. And so without fundamental change, we do not expect any significant progress in regional regeneration by 2030 or even 2035. So following on from Ben, what this also requires is substantial targeted investment in several areas, particularly housing, transport, education, and skills, but in a way that can crowd in private investments, and together this can raise productivity and living standards across the country. So that is our central view. Now, in order to express the view, what we're going to do is also go a bit more granular on the regional side, and we are going to see some implications of that in the next few slides. But broadly, what does this leave us? UK GDP trend growth rate coming from the macro side is about 1% per year. productivity overall rise about 0.5% per year, nothing much. And growth in most regions is just above zero. But the levels are highly unequal within and across regions. So by historical and international comparison, the divergence is substantial in the United Kingdom. We think that weak regional growth is a drag on aggregate growth, as is substantial falling back of the second-tier cities to London and the Southeast, which is also a drag on aggregate economic activity in the United Kingdom. So in order to see this a bit better, here are two charts showing productivity, in particular against the productivity challenges of the country. On the right-hand side, we see that productivity in London is substantially higher, about twice as much higher than many other regions of the country. And it is rising a bit, but then there are regions, particularly the Midlands, where it is projected to fall. So our projections are that it will fall a little bit. Now, where are the regions with lower productivity across the country? So that is shown on the map on the left-hand side. So this is regional productivity projected for 2025, end of 2025. And we can see that the middle belt of the country, Wales, the Midlands, Yorkshire and Northeast, and also Northern Ireland, these are the places where productivity is the lowest. At the same time as London and the Southeast power ahead with higher productivity. So this is the overall situation with respect to regional disparities. Let us decompose this a little bit further. So after the slowdown, because of the pandemic and various other reasons, geopolitical reasons, London is once again pulling ahead. The productivity projected to rise from 68 pounds per hour walk to 70. But most regions are projected to see modest productivity increases, except for the Midlands, where we project a fall in productivity, a small fall in productivity. Putting productivity aside, what about living standards? Ben has already shown you the distribution across the households, so across the income deciles. Here's the distribution across different parts of the country. And once again, what is very, what is the problem is that the pattern does not really change much. The regions of the country which have been entrenched in their, in their backward position still remain backward. To see this further, living standards are recovering faster in London and the Southeast than all other parts of the country. But particularly in the Northeast, the gap in living standards per household relative to London, which was around 4,500 pounds in 2019, by 2023, it has widened to something like 7,500 pounds. So this shows enormous disparities and persistent entrenched disparities regionally. But not all news has been bad. In some areas, the country has made progress. So here's at a more granular level, we'll look at digital connectivity and the progress which has been made over the period 2019 to 2023. And we see across the country, all regions, including city regions here at the international territorial level 2 or city region level, they have made progress in digital connectivity, which is not surprising. We were hit by the pandemic shock and people started working from home. So substantial advances were made with respect to connectivity. In fact, on average, across the country, there is 1.6 standard deviations improvement in digital connectivity. The biggest progress is, of course, in London and parts of the Southwest, and certain regions of parts of Scotland have progressed a bit lower than other places, but by and large, this is a positive story across the country. Does it say positive everywhere in all aspects? No. Well, obviously not. So in primary school education, there is a fallback across the entire country, almost across the entire country. Standards of primary school education have deteriorated, partly because of the COVID lockdowns and the lost generation of young people who have missed out part of their school curriculum or school attendance. And then attendance has not substantially picked up later on, and we have a mention of this in the King's speech as well. So on average, there is 2.1 standard deviations falling backwards. So at the same time as we have made progress across the country in digital connectivity, we have fallen behind in terms of primary school education. There are certain parts of Scotland which have bucked this general trend somewhat, but that is on a very low base. So yeah, that needs to be remembered. What about other areas of potential progress? With respect to housing as well, we have fallen behind. Somewhat less than in terms of primary school education, but we have still fallen behind. So housing, in particular housing supply and affordability, has declined across the country since 2019, since the pre-pandemic period. In terms of new ownership, in rentals, and the rate of decline is second, as I said, only to primary school education. Where is the decline more pronounced? In parts of the southeast, other parts of the south, Yorkshire and the Humber, and in cities like Belfast and Glasgow. Whereas there are some parts of the country, particularly parts of Wales and Cornwall, which have seen some marginal improvement. But by and large, this is also a negative story. And the new government has been focusing a little bit on housing as well. And let us see what that brings us. So overall, in terms of policy priorities, there are entrenched disparities which require, we think, brave, bold action and public investment at 4 to 5% per year, together with a rethink of fiscal rules, which Ben talked about, is, we think, the order of the day. But this needs to be targeted appropriately in a way that can provide the best possibilities for local growth and productivity in areas such as housing, transport, education, and skills, and in a way that brings in private investments together with it. So for that, we need close coordination of national growth and productivity strategy with local and regional growth plans. So with that, I leave you back to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnab. Thank you very much, Ben and Barry as well. Thanks for those of you who've put questions into the chat or into the Q&A. It's easier actually if you put them into the chat, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to offer people an opportunity to ask the questions that they've asked in the Q&A and chat. If you have any questions, do please put them into the chat now. We still got plenty of time, I think. But I'm going to start with Gamal Shaheen. Gamal, hopefully you should be able to unmute yourself, and then if you can ask your question. Okay. I'm hoping that the technology is working here. Okay, I can see you. Are you able to unmute yourself, Gamal? Okay, technology is obviously not working, so I'm going to ask Gamal's question on his behalf. I hope you don't mind. It's to everyone, really. We saw last week how much the global market lost because of the latest data from the USA. So question is, how do all of us see the stability of the markets with a lot of challenges ahead? So Barry, maybe you'd like to tackle that one.
I guess I'd think about a couple of things. One is, if you look, say, at the Nikkei index, it fell 12% one day and then rose 10 the next, the largest single day gain for approximately 20 years. There's clearly something about Japan and the recent behavior of the yen and Japanese monetary policy, in effect, going the way to the rest of the world, which has created some sort of difficulty, I guess, in how financing is flowing in the bigger picture from Japan to the US, particularly in markets. I think in terms of markets, I guess my usual default position is to think about the States and to think about the data point that Gamal's referring to was the employment numbers, the jobs numbers, which were weaker than expected. I guess we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes things are going to turn out weaker than expected. We've had a long run of a lot stronger than expected. But in our global outlook, we talk a little bit about one of the indicators of the US economy that people have looked at for quite a long time, 30, 40 years now, which is the degree of inversion of the yield curve. The yield curve has been strongly inverted now for the best part of 18 months and would normally, we'd think, well, that's indicating a recession. Those who've called recession have been hopelessly wrong, I guess, so far, but the yield curve's still inverted. And so maybe, the idea that we'll see a slowdown in the US is the thing that will happen. And when we start to see a slowdown, then we would see weaker employment number than expected, which after a long period of strong growth might come as somewhat of a shock. But I don't see that there are the sort of systematic issues around the financial sector and around markets more generally, other than perhaps some of the, I guess, overvalued tech stocks than that we've seen before. I hope that helps you think about it anyway.
Thanks, Barry. Gamal, I know you have now managed to unmute yourself, so I don't know if you want to respond to that.
What is the dangers of the geopolitics for the growth of the economy? We have the war in Ukraine, we have the tension in Middle East and Red Sea, and also we have some tension around the American election. There is like some fears if Trump is coming again, the relationship with Europe will be a little bit hard. They can't support Ukraine alone. So how this will affect the growth and the stability of the economy?
Well, can I sort of jump in?
Yeah.
I don't think we claim any specific, I certainly don't claim any specific expertise about what would happen if the war in Ukraine went one way or another way. All we're observing at the moment is the situation that has continued for a while. And similarly, in terms of the US election, we don't have a strong view on who is going to win and what would be the result of their policies at the moment. And it appears that public opinion in the US is very much in line with our not having a strong view on these things. These are things we see as risks to our central forecast, not part of the central forecast. I hope that explains.
Thanks, Barry. I'm going to go to James Watson, who has a factual question on one of our charts. Although Ben showed the chart, I think it's probably Arnab who's going to answer it. But James, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Over to you, James. Well, the technology just is not working today. Okay, I will ask it then, Arnab. The living standards measure we use, does it adjust the nominal to real deflator for differing shares of spending in each income group?
No, at the moment it does not. However, what it adjusts for is differential spending on housing across different deciles of the income distribution. It's a very good question because the effective inflation is different for different people across the income distribution. For our analysis, that comes on the expenditure side of the analysis. What we were showing you today is the income side, and we have not adjusted incomes for differential inflation across the distribution. But that is a very good point, and we will keep note of it. Maybe if you want to interact further with that question, please do send us a note as well. So we will, take that on further. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnab. Thanks, James. I'm going to go next to Bernard, who has a question that's near and dear to my heart, but I'm going to allow Ben to answer it. Bernard, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello.
You can, we can hear you.
Great, that works. I got the first prize for that. I asked whether can or should pension funds contribute to the, between inverted commas, crowding in of private investment to improve UK infrastructure. And I was partly motivated by remarks by the Chancellor the other day, who suggested that we ought to move to Canadian-style pension funds, who, according to her, have done it rather well. Those of you who know me will know that I've written more letters to the Financial Times, some of which have been published, which actually say the Canadian pension funds are actually doing something very different, and they're not the kind of pension funds which Rachel Reeves appears to be talking about. But that's another matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Ben.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Bernard. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that the UK pensions perform quite differently, and compared to Canada, compared to North America, compared to a lot of other countries. To be honest, I don't have a clear answer whether it's the right or wrong thing to do. But given that pensions in the UK, and they're often tied to sort of legacy industries that don't perform that well, so maybe some kind of readjustment and some pension funds that are pushed into areas where we do need investment might be helpful. But I don't have a sort of off-the-cuff answer off the top of my head. But I think it's a very good question. I think it's definitely something that we should explore a lot more, because UK equities and UK pensions don't perform that well vis-a-vis comparable economies. So I think it's a very interesting question to explore. Thank you.
Indeed, the pensions review that the Chancellor announced will be doing precisely that. And you'll be pleased to know that NIESR has already been speaking to the people who are doing the pensions review. So hopefully we'll be able to input our thoughts into that whole process that's being run out of the Treasury and DWP. Okay, I'm going to move on to Bob Bradley. Bob, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. Fantastic.
Good. I think the new government's looking at increasing the rate of house building, particularly in the southeast across the home counties, as that's where the economic growth is and demand is, or demand is most. But my question is, won't that compound the regional disparity that you've been talking about and cause more migration towards the London southeast, and then sort of compound the separation of London southeast from the rest of the country?
Arnab, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. That is a very good question. So before getting into that, let me just point out that over the past 1 year, we have been doing some work funded by the Nuffield Foundation towards trying to get a more disaggregated picture regionally across the whole of the country in terms of how different parts of the country are progressing or not. And housing is, of course, an important part of that question. You will be seeing more coming out of the National Institute in this area over the next 1 or 2 months. So please keep tuned in. Now, specifically with respect to housing, this is one of the reasons why we looked at housing. And we do actually find that in terms of needs, one can make a case for parts of the southeast and parts of the east of England in particular, in terms of very strong housing needs. What that does across the country is something that we are very keen to understand, because what matters quite a lot is not only what benefits that any kind of housing build or other housing investment provides to the local population, but what externalities are provided across the whole of the country. And so in spatial terms, we call this the spatial direct and indirect effects. So we are quite keen to understand that. And on the basis of this analysis, then to provide more specific insights and evidence base as to where housing needs are most and where housing needs need to be most acutely and urgently addressed to reduce regional disparities across the whole of the country. We do not have a final answer to this question, but we have started asking the question, and we are encouraged to do that also by the newly named Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So we are working quite closely with them to try, and they are asking the same question as well. So we'll come with more answers to your question, but overall, the question is a fair question because, so of course, London and the southeast and parts of the east of England, the home counties, have seen greater prosperity over the past, many, many decades. So what is the economic and social regional case for placing further investments there?
Okay, we're gonna stick on regional disparities and move from housing to education. So John Fitzgerald, John, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
My question is, human capital is very important in explaining regional differences in productivity within EU countries. You don't put much emphasis on it for the UK, and Scotland has the highest education attainment to the working age population after London. And I think your chart showed that excluding London, it also has higher productivity than other regions. Are there policy lessons?
Yes, John, again, this is a excellent question. Right, okay, so the chart that we showed, so yes, you're absolutely right. We showed the productivity chart and we showed the primary education chart. The other part of the question, which perhaps relates even more to your specific question, is about skills, and we have not shown that. We are also trying to understand skills distribution across the whole of the country. And together, all of these will give us a better sense of where we want to be in terms of, an evidence base towards more more planned development across the whole of the country, more planned regional development. Well, the government is signaling some, intention to go down that route. However, the evidence base needs to be developed, and we are certainly, it is true that we have not done that for a long time, which is all the more reason that we should be doing it now. The link between the primary education, skills, and productivity across different parts of the country, and how we can use potentially regional planning to address not only regional disparities, but basically raise productivity across the whole of the country. So these are very important questions that we are asking at the moment. And if you have further insights or you want to have further discussions about that, please do come back to us. So we want to do it all together. So these are big questions.
Absolutely. And then we could go on and on and on about regional disparities, etc. We have in the Q&A an intriguing line from Paul Hudson. Paul, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and turn one sentence into a question. Paul, are you around? He's no longer here. Oh, okay. So Paul Hudson's no longer here. So I'm going to ask his question in the way that I think I would phrase it. So the issue is we spend a lot of time thinking about productivity. And there are questions, of course, of the way the productivity is measured, and is it actually picking up improvements in standards of living? So I don't know, Ben and Arnab, if you have thoughts on that. Why is productivity so important, and are we actually measuring it properly?
Right, okay, so measurement of productivity is not an easy problem, and there is a substantial discourse in this issue, which we are aware of at the moment. For the purposes of our regional and distribution analysis, we are basically doing gross value added per hour worked as the measure of productivity. But measurement of productivity itself is very critical. And let me also add that it is even further critical in the modern world, where we take we not only focus our attention on two major factors of production, which is fixed capital and labor, loosely defined, but also on a host of additional elements of capital, including natural capital, institutional capital, so on and so forth. So these are questions which we are thinking about. But that's where I will leave it now. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question, of course. Measurement is always a issue that we have to deal with in economics, but I'd give a fairly brief answer. So, I mean, the issues with measurement of productivity are the same issues that we have with measurement of GDP. No one really has an issue with measuring hours worked. That's fairly straightforward. So all of those issues really revolve around GVA, GDP. What do we include in GDP? How do we make quality adjustments? And there is a large literature on GDP, how we measure it, how we might improve it. So it is a well-trodden path, and people do think about it. The reason why GDP often wins out is because it is a really convenient metric, and it still has a lot of power in explaining economic activity, and it's still a very useful tool. And it's the convenience and comparability over time, which is why GDP is still successful, and therefore conventional measures of productivity are widely used. And that would be my sort of justification for why we use those measures. They're not perfect, though. Granted, there's always room for improvement.
Thank you, Ben. Gamal, who asked the very first question, I'm going to give you the last one as well. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask your new question. Assuming you can unmute yourself, which seems to be a problem. Oh, there we go.
Thanks again. We would like, how much the UK economy is resilient and strong enough, as we can see the latest thing said there are 4% drop in the footfall because of the riots. We are heading to see a decline of the growth again, and then maybe a new recession? Thanks.
Will the riots on their own cause a new recession? Ben?
I would say that the magnitude of that impact wouldn't be enough to cause a contraction of 2 quarters contraction in GDP. That would be quite significant. Of course, what's happened with those riots is terrible and awful. But I think the sort of pass-through to the economic impact, there will be felt within localities and regions, but on the aggregate, I think it would be too small to be detectable. And that would be my assessment, but quite happy to hear if Arnab has some views on this one.
Well, neither do I expect very large impacts overall. And besides, let us see what it does, whether this continues. This has been a couple of weeks with a somewhat lost output. But the impact has so far not been very large. But if it continues for a substantial amount of time, that can cause further disruptions. Not only disruptions, it can also cause cause frictions in how different parts of the country can generate positive externalities on each other. So that is to be seen, but at the moment it doesn't look very large.
Thank you both. It's now midday, so I'm going to close this out. I will take the opportunity, though, in light of the last question, to send out our best wishes and our thoughts for everybody who's been affected by the recent riots, the communities that have been attacked. It has been truly awful, and rest assured that our thoughts are all with you. on that on that somewhat somber note, though, I'd like to thank everybody who's attended today's economic forum. I'd like to thank Ben and Barry and Arnab for their excellent presentations. We will make the slides available, and also, I believe, the recording of this. Neil has let everyone know that in the chat, so you will be able to go back and look at the slides. Well, the slides are there now, in fact, which is fantastic. So the slides are there already, but we'll also put the recording out at some point in the near future. Other than that, let me take this opportunity to wish you all a wonderful August. Hopefully you all manage to get a holiday in somewhere, and NIESR will be back with our autumn economic forum in November. So we'll all look forward to seeing you then. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.